Hey class, today we're going to talk about trade empires in the Spice Islands. We're going to focus in on Portugal. So, we left off yesterday, or in the last one, kind of talking about how Spain has discovered the Americas, and Spain kind of lost sight of their original goal, which was India and spices. Spain starts setting up colonies, they're getting sugar cane, they're getting, silver from mines. Portugal, on the other hand, had remained steadfast in their quest for pepper, cinnamon, nutmegs, and clove. While Spain had crossed the ocean to the New World, Portugal was taking a different route. They were looking to go the long way in a difficult journey down the coast of Africa. So they were trying to, again, get to India, but going eastward and going south and east down African coast. The Portuguese were unsure if they would actually ever make it to India. Africa is massive, and they didn't really know how big the continent was. They didn't have maps that accurately detailed how long it was or how far south it went. And there are also, even at the time, some kind of scientists who theorized that the Indian Ocean was actually entirely surrounded by land and was essentially a massive lake. So they didn't even know if you could get around the bottom of Africa to get to the Indian Ocean. But year by year, the Portuguese moved further and further down the African continent, building forts, meeting natives along the way. The Portuguese made sure to mark their territory by placing massive stone crosses at major stopping points, the mouths of the river, and at the far end of each trip. The following explorers would use these padrao, is what they were called, as waypoints on their own journeys to push further and further. So essentially, the whole idea was if you're an explorer for the Portuguese, you would set out on your quest, you'd go down the coast of Africa, and when you got to the end of how far you went, right, you might discover some new area. You might find a big lake, or not a lake, a big river that you would use as kind of like a nice waypoint. You would set up this large, massive stone, and you can still see some of them today, actually, which I think is really interesting. They have them in museums. But they would set up one of these massive padrao, and then they would head home. The next year, another explorer might follow your same footsteps, and they would see your padrao, and they would say, okay, this is as far as this person went. I'm going to go another 50 miles, 100 miles, however far. And then they would set out their padrao and return home. And so by this, they were kind of like leaving breadcrumbs, right? They were always able to see how far previous explorers had gone, and they were always going to be able to retrace their steps back home. And kind of, it wasn't necessarily a way to mark territory so much as is a way to kind of understand how far they were going as they were trying to, make this trip around the bottom of Africa. So, in 1488, Bartolomeo Diaz finally rounded the southern tip of Africa, officially finding himself in the Indian Ocean for the first time. So he is the first European to round the southern tip of Africa. He returned to tell his discovery, and soon more Portuguese would make the trip around the Cape of Good Hope, as his route was soon called. Now, in 1497, the Portuguese explorer Vasco da Gama would land in Calicut, India, and the spice trade was officially begin. So Vasco da Gama is the first European to make it to India via a sea route like this. Da Gama's trip was so important to the Portuguese government that he was given an entire town as a reward. Da Gama's journey, just for a little context, and I know some of our exploration groups talked about this, he lost many ships along the way. He came back and he had, his crew was very small compared to what they had when they had left. But the small number of ships that they had were so weighed down with spices by the time they returned, and the value of these spices was so great that essentially they were able to pay for many, many, many more trips in the future, right? This one kind of dilapidated handful of ships that made it back were able to pay for fleets worth of ships just because of the value of the spices they brought back. And the Portuguese recognized that they were going to be able to make a ton of money through the spice trade. Portugal, when they find a route to Africa, I don't know why my little GIF isn't working right now, but it's a real shame. So, Portuguese exploration. So trade in the Indian Ocean, as we've talked about before, was well developed already, with goods traveling between China, the Spice Islands, Africa, and India. But these routes were dominated mostly by Muslim traders from the Ottoman Empire, the Safavid Empire, and the Mughal Empire. Now, the Portuguese began to set up some trade forts along the coastline. They wanted to encourage merchants to come and sell the spices to them. But kind of part of the problem is Not a lot of these towns were very welcoming to the outsiders. They didn't trust the Portuguese. For one, the Portuguese are Christian, and like I said, a lot of these places are Muslim. But also, the Portuguese didn't necessarily have a ton of goods that were super valuable. They didn't have a lot of things that these other merchants wanted, so they didn't have value. So the Portuguese turned to a different method. They start using what is called gunboat diplomacy. They started using their gunpowder weapons to their advantage. So what they would do is they would heavily arm their ships. And if a town refused to let them set up a trade fort, they might blow them sky high until they surrendered. They might pull up with their boats, point their cannons at the town and say, look, we want to set up a trade fort. We want to be trading with you. We're going to give you a deal. If you don't trade with us, we will unload these cannons. And by using gunboat diplomacy, they were able to essentially fight their way into a dominant position in Indian Ocean, fighting with the Ottoman and the Safavid fleets along the way. There were several kind of wars between the Ottomans and the Portuguese. And a lot of cities essentially were unable to stand up to the bombardment and would submit to the Portuguese and agree to some kind of trade deal. And they would sell goods to the Portuguese. Now, they might not sell them the best quality pepper or the best goods, but the Portuguese were happy with whatever they could get, especially since they were kind of bullying their way into this. So here's a quote from a merchant who is writing to a ruler in Calicut. He says, "Your Majesty, we are astonished that you should lower yourself by receiving these Portuguese enemies into your kingdom, who seem to be pirates rather than merchants. We, your Muslim subjects, have always been loyal to you, and have brought you valuable foreign merchandise to this country, and have exported its native products to increase your revenue greatly. You appear to forget all this. By receiving those newcomers into your favor, as your own numerous and faithful subjects were incompetent for the purpose. In this you dishonor yourself and embolden these strangers to hold your power in contempt. The true intent of the Portuguese in coming into these seas is to take possession of your city, not to trade for spices as they pretend. The place you have given them for a trading post, they will convert into a fort, and from where they will make war on you when you least expect it." So you can see there are Indian merchants who recognize that the Portuguese are strong-arming their way in, that they shouldn't be trusted, they shouldn't be allowed to continue trading. But in a lot of cases, these Indian merchants or these Indian kind of cities have to make a deal with them. So, since, not only are they attacking cities and towns with this gunboat diplomacy, but they're going to kind of partake in what I would call official piracy. Since many merchant ships in the Indian Ocean were unarmed, the Portuguese started to prey on those vessels. They would isolate ships and take their precious cargo for themselves like pirates. Often the Portuguese would set up ambushes in order to capture ships that were unaware. They would wait, and if a ship was weighed down with silver or gold or spices, they would just pull up, say, "Give us your cargo, and if you don't, we're going to sink you," right? So here is another local ruler who is writing to the Ottoman Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent. In this quote, he says, "As you know, the pilgrim and merchant vessels from all the ports of Indonesia must pass through the Maldive Islands on their way to Mecca and the Red Sea. And between the 24,000 Maldive Islands, there are just 4 channels where a ship can pass safely. The infidel Portuguese wait around the entrances of these channels. When our ships arrive there, the Portuguese stop and take possession of as many as they can. Any ship they cannot capture, they sink with cannon fire, either leaving the Muslims aboard to drown or capturing and enslaving them. The Portuguese have even dared to attack Ottoman ships belonging to your Majesty. For example, in the year 1565, your officials came to Aceh and left for Istanbul, loaded with pepper, silk, cinnamon, cloves, and other products from Indonesia. Portuguese vessels intercepted the ships at Maldives and sank it. 500 Muslims drowned, and the rest were enslaved." So we can see this guy is writing to the Ottoman Sultan saying, look, there is a problem here. Not only are they attacking our ships, they're attacking your ships, right? So another famous thing that the Portuguese would do were called safe conduct passes. So essentially, if a ship wanted to avoid losing all of their goods, the Portuguese would offer them a safe conduct pass. A ship carrying a safe conduct pass would not be raided and would be able to sell their goods at a Portuguese port for profit. But if a ship didn't have a safe conduct pass, they were toast. So essentially they were creating like little passes, and the Portuguese would pull up to a boat and say, "Hey, do you have your pass?" And if the boat didn't, they would either force them to buy a pass or they would threaten to sink their ship again. And so each year, also, the price of a safe conduct pass might increase. They were trying to squeeze more and more money out of these merchant vessels. Here's how one Muslim historian described it. He says, after the Portuguese had established themselves in Cochin on the Malabar coast, they forced every vessel, however small, to carry a safe conduct pass, which was issued for a certain fee. The Portuguese, in imposing this toll, claimed that it would improve commerce. To enforce the toll, they seized the cargo and crew of any ship that did not have its pass. In addition to this system of persecution, the Portuguese deployed ships all over the Indian Ocean to lie in wait and intercept vessels. In this way, they unjustly acquired vast wealth and captured countless prisoners. So, in summary, right, the trade empire set up by the Portuguese led to immense wealth for them. They could obtain spices for a deep discount. They could strong arm goods through piracy, but they were creating a lot of enemies for themselves. Soon, other Europeans, like the Dutch, who we'll talk about later, and the British, who we won't get to talk about, but do become involved in this situation, they would enter the Indian Ocean, and they would have an easier time finding allies with people who are working to fight against the Portuguese, right? The Dutch were able to find allies in India who really disliked the Portuguese, and just by acting a little bit kinder towards them, were able to find, beneficial trade deals. So by the mid-1600s, the trade empire formed by the Portuguese was essentially a shadow of what it had been. So for about 100 years, they really dominate, but it really declines pretty rapidly. The end. So we will talk about the Dutch VOC next and their use of some different tactics in the Indian Ocean.